Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, we have a special treat for you as I moderate a discussion between the VP of Enrollment at Colorado College, Mark Hatch, and our own esteemed Susan Tree, as they are going to reflect on 5 decades in admissions and go decade by decade from the 80s all the way up to the 2020s in what will be a 2-parter. And in part 1 of 2, we'll talk about what was going on in the 80s and the 90s. Our question from a listener comes from Maya from Southern California. And she has Black students, and she wants to know, how can I know that my student is attending a university or college that is going to be a safe space from a racial standpoint, that they won't encounter a lot of discrimination, that they won't feel imposter syndrome, that they'll feel supported, and also one that will have a decent critical mass of students while also staying on the West Coast. For our interview, Julie and I will continue our interview with Lee Coffin, the Vice Provost of Enrollment at Dartmouth College. And we're talking tough questions about college admissions in part 2 of 4. And for our interview, Kevin Newton is back. And this time he's not focusing on a particular international school, but he's going to teach us about the concept of clearing. What is clearing in the UCAS system? And how can your knowledge of clearing open up opportunities for you if you want to go to an international university? Friends, super excited today. We're here with Mark Hatch and Susan Tree. Hi, Mark. Hi, Susan.
Hey, Mark Stecker.
Good afternoon, Mark and Susan.
And this is a really exciting episode. We haven't done anything kind of quite like what we're going to do today. So Mark's the VP of Enrollment at Colorado College. And regular listeners know we've started a rotation with Colorado College. Every 3 months, we have one of the professionals come in and just share some cutting edge things they're seeing in file reading. And we've had, Hillary Dickman, who's actually been on twice on the podcast. And we've also had Karen Christoph on twice. And then we had Matt Bonser on. He was on once, but we did a double episode with him. He had really good content. And so we're excited to have the big cheese, the big dog today, Mark.
The JV team, the junior varsity team here. Happy to report to duty.
Well, I'll just tell a little background. So I've known Hillary now for 3 to 4 years, and she's always impressed me. And then I did the fly-in program last July, and both, Karen and Matt really impressed me. I'd actually met Karen through Hillary before that. And then Susan has always spoken so highly of you, Mark. So I said that was part of what made us reach out to Colorado College. Like, we have a quartet here of 4 outstanding professionals. And the exciting thing that our listeners are going to learn is that Mark and Susan go back to the 80s. I'll let them tell their story, but we're going to do something unique on the podcast. We're going to talk about how admissions has changed decade by decade from the 80s walking up until now. So why don't we start with sort of how the two of you met? You want to share that, Mark?
Sure. Back in the 80s, when I was a late blooming male in my 20s, I'm now a late blooming male in my 50s. I went on a college visit in the early 80s and was actually an athletic recruit, thinking I was just going to go hang out with the track team at my alma mater, Bates College, and got there, and the coach paraded me into the admission office and said, "You're going to go interview with this woman named Susan Tree."
And you still remember like a question or something that was asked in that interview.
Yeah, it's the problem is when the question comes up, I start sweating even 40 years later.
40-year sweat.
Susan was wonderfully welcoming and maybe forgiving a little bit because I'm not sure I could even make eye contact back then. So it's a good thing this is a podcast.
No, you were terrific, Mark Hatch. I remember, and I remember that at that time you were a senior at boarding school, right? In
day school in Braintree, Mass.
That's right. And your folks were educators, and you were, if I'm remembering correctly, you were the top prep school cross country runner in New England.
Wow, he's so humble.
Am I right about that?
Fast on my feet, slow with my words.
No. But the Bates coach was thought you were going to go D1, and he'd never have a chance. But the budding scholar in you made you rethink that liberal arts college, where you could also run at a high level, might be a great fit. And I will say that Mark Hatch basically ended up running the admissions office tour guide program and overnight hosting program in fact, I believe you founded the overnight hosting program. And I have this picture in my mind of you sitting in the dining commons, snagging people that you needed as hosts for prospective students. So we called them subfrosh, Mark.
Yes, we did.
They were subfrosh, which I always thought was a great name. And
I remember two things. One, I did get the moniker or nickname Dean Hatch,
yes,
probably by my junior year. And that was the same year I got a raise to $3.25 an hour.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, I was rich. I hit the payload there.
Well, but you were an academic American for Bates for, I think, all of your years, did us proud. And aside from working for our office, then you graduated and went away. I remember you were, I think, at Procter & Gamble maybe for a couple of years. Then you came back and started working in our office as an assistant dean of admissions. So it came true, and you were a fabulous colleague.
Well, you were a fabulous mentor, Susan, and I learned a tremendous amount in the 80s from you and working with you, and I'm grateful for that time. You've always been someone I've looked up to.
Oh, you're very kind. I just think it's wonderful that we both journeyed through this profession of college admissions, and we both flip-flopped around. You know, you got your graduate degree in higher ed, right? I got mine in school counseling, and then I switched from college admissions to a secondary school, and you switched from college to secondary, back to college. And, you know, you've had just such incredible experiences, Mark Hatch, on so many different parts of this. And I'm just so glad we continue to share this profession.
Well, I know as we go through the decades, we'll probably go through my many jobs. And, Mark, you know, it's a story of five jobs in 15 years, wanted in one or two states and unwanted in all the rest. And finally landed at Colorado College, where I've been for 2 decades.
And where you parented 2 wonderful daughters through the process, too.
Yes.
So that's a great segue for us to talk about the decade of the 80s and what was going on in admissions in the 80s. Mark, we don't have you here that often, so I'm going to have you kick off a topic and get a little commentary from Susan.
You know, I think that the 80s was still a time where students weren't applying to that many colleges. They had to use the manual typewriter and feed the paper Common App into the feed, the ring, so to speak, and then you carried some whiteout that might be all over your hands and so forth. So why could anyone apply to 10 colleges when it took an extra 5 hours to fill out one app?
Yeah. So, Susan, anything you want to add to that about the 80s?
Well, you know, I landed at Bates right about 1980, and Bates at that time was a very fine liberal arts college, but it was a very modest school. It had a modest self-image. It had been founded not for the kind of the white sons of the upper class, as we used to say, the Anglos in Maine, whose families owned the mills. Bates had a very egalitarian perspective right from the beginning, and wanted to enroll what at that time was a diverse student body, which basically was women and men. It was co-ed from the very, very beginning. It enrolled students of color much earlier than most of the other small liberal arts colleges. I think second almost to none. But the interesting thing was that Bates saw the enrollment cliff of the 80s into the 90s coming, when the industrialized states, especially in the Northeast, which were our feeder states at the college and for most of the New England schools, was going to tank, and that we better start developing a more national image and recruiting plan. So we got out ahead of a lot of the schools, and we spent the 1980s traveling to places the college had never recruited at before, and really making an effort to get to increase the visibility of the school. You have to remember, at this time, there really were no rankings, there were no magazines, there just was not much of anything out there except for the Barron's Guide to Colleges, which was all facts and figures. So it was up to the college to create its own brand. And no one talked about marketing. In fact, it was kind of a dirty word. And even the word recruiting was kind of for lowlife, not for the likes of selective colleges. But that's what I was part of, and I took on the New York metro area and a couple of tertiary territories for Bates, and started basically visiting a lot of high schools and opening doors. I think the visionary leadership in our office, and I will tip my hat to Bill Hiss, the now retired dean of admissions, but someone who became a national figure in college admissions and student-centered admissions while bringing in a marketing dimension. He really formalized at the college a recruiting plan that embraced diversity and led the research that resulted in one of the very first test optional admissions policies. And Mark, I have a feeling that you applied before the college did that, but we were already doing a beta. We were involved in the beta testing for optional reading.
I think the beta testing, when they saw my test scores, is they would blink a couple of times and move on to the next piece in the file. But seriously, Susan, you're right. And as a young admission officer in the late 80s, I remember getting on a plane and landing in Albuquerque, New Mexico, not a place where Bates had any sort of presence at all. And through some Bates connection, I was picked up by Joseph Abeda, who had been to the ed school at Harvard, and I landed there a couple of years later. But Joseph Abeda was the superintendent of the Santa Fe Indian School. And,
oh my gosh!
He took me on a trip to 3 pueblos in one day, and I got an education from him. He exposed me to principals, school leaders. I got to present to the tribal council at the Pueblo of Laguna. This is before any sort of sophisticated marketing. And
right.
What a privilege it was to go out and try to tell the story. We enrolled, I think, 2 kids from Albuquerque that year. And then, of course, I visited a handful of other schools in the Southwest, and Bates was really trying hard to get out of New England, their home base. And what a privilege it was to sort of get on a plane and see a very different part of the country.
Oh, that's absolutely amazing. And that was the beginning of, for a lot of colleges, of the formal recruiting of underrepresented populations. All we had as a tool at that point was the College Board Student Search Service, but that only reached kids who were already taking the PSAT, right? There wasn't any other way really to get at them. So a lot of us used our alumni networks, our alums who were in education, as you did, Mark. You also have to think about, at that time, college was a lot less expensive. I think private liberal arts colleges rank. What did you say, Mark Hatch, when you went to Bates? How much was it in the late 80s?
11,200, and Susan knows this, but I came from a family that my father was eighth generation from a tiny Maine coastal town,
That's right.
well north of Maine. Although I grew up in the Boston area because he was the first in his family to get an education. So I was deeply appreciative of landing at Bates with an older brother and sister in college. I think my father made about $18,000 a year, and my mother was still going to school, not quite yet launching her career. The need-based financial aid was extraordinary. Susan knows this. I think I got turned down for my first 4 jobs as a work-study student and had to lick and stuff envelopes in the back office of the admission office. But at the time, I think you're right, Susan. There really wasn't such a divide on the Bates campus between, I guess, what I would call the haves and have-nots.
You're absolutely right.
So many people were working and on need-based financial aid and didn't really know those who really weren't on aid, maybe with a couple of exceptions. And I appreciated the humble roots or culture that Bates cultivated, and that permeated actually the Office of Admission. That some deeply passionate educators who really wanted to expand Bates's reach. We were very much in a space where we were offering a service and education. And I think Susan and I, as we get to this next decade, can talk a little bit about how maybe the 90s felt like we were beginning in a business, in a very large sort of marketing engine that hit college admissions in the early 90s, maybe with the introduction of the World Wide Web in 93.
That absolutely was a huge turning point.
So that's a great segue. We can go into the 90s. But before we transition to the 90s, we had a great planning meeting before. We went over a lot of things, and Susan put together a great list of multiple things for us to choose from, and we decided we'd focus on one main topic. But Susan, can you just list some of the other things just in list view that were also going on in the 80s, and we won't talk about them, but we'll let our listeners know some of the other possible things that we considered making the focal point?
Sure. This was from my brain dump as I was trying to remember the decades of our
The brain dump is working pretty well over there. Mark and I were both impressed.
Thank you very much. So I'm looking at my notes, and I said colleges moved from regional to national recruitment. Students surged the College Board. National college fairs were fairly new, and colleges were visiting high schools, as Mark described. Less dependence on feeder schools, which was an enormous shift in recruiting from the day when 30, 40 students would come from one school in one state and go to the same college. It was just what we used to call pipelines, where diversification of the applicant pool and the first-year class became a priority. Women's colleges were going co-ed. There was the beginnings of conversation about need-aware admissions and whether or not it was better for a college to deny a needy student, and they would never know that had been part of the admissions decision, or was it better to what was called admit deny, which is admit a student and then deny them financial support. That was a debate that started and continued throughout that decade. In the 80s, faculty were starting to get involved in recruitment, that it was not only seen as the admissions office job, but faculty had to learn to represent what they were delivering in their academic programs and also to help with the enrollment of high-end students in their fields. Division III athletic recruiting took off, where it was just not the domain of the D1 schools, but the D3 schools. College prep curricula started proliferating in the high schools. We saw the beginnings of the International Baccalaureate rising up in American high schools. It was not just abroad, but beginning to challenge the high-end curricula here, the golden standard, which had been AP until that time. we saw the first guidebook come out, the FIS Guide to Colleges, that was considered to be an underground guidebook, and an evaluative guidebook trying to evaluate campus life and culture, which no book had tried to do before. And it had a lot of credibility after it ironed out some of the kinks. I don't know if Mark Hatcher remembers the beginning of it, where they published all sorts of unfounded information and got slammed by lawsuits, but they got it together, and it has become and continues to be, I think, one of the better qualitative guidebooks. Also, we saw the very beginning of consumer online educational services at the very end of the 80s, as we began to see the effects of the internet becoming popular for consumer use, although University of Phoenix beat everybody to it before a lot of us even knew what the internet was.
Pretty awesome memory there. Thank you for that, Susan. So now we're into the 90s, Mark. Tell us, one, what stands out for you in the 90s, and also talk to us about where you are in the 90s working-wise. What are you doing in that decade?
So I was the son of two educators, and I decided after graduate school to leave college admissions and try my hand at teaching in college counseling. So I moved west 1991, fresh out of graduate school, to take my first ever teaching and college counseling job at the Harvard Westlake School in Los Angeles. That had been separate entities until that fall and merged between the Harvard School for Boys and the Westlake School for Girls. And I spent 3 terrific years there, followed by 3 great years at Marlborough School for Girls on the high school side, and really developed an appreciation for the wealth of colleges out there, the options that students had near and far, and certainly maybe my first real exposure to flagship publics that were very, very popular, the UCs in particular. And it was just a great experience.
And Susan, tell us what you were doing in the 90s.
What was I doing in the 90s? Well, I finished my school counseling graduate degree. It took me 5 years to do because I was working full-time in admissions. Finished that degree in 89. For my thesis at the University of Southern Maine, I was invited to I was in the process also of writing for a textbook, the first textbook to hit the market for educators who wanted to have more background in college counseling and financial aid. And a counselor educator in Connecticut started writing this book. It was called Counseling for College. And it was going to become a KCREP recommended resource for school counseling programs. She'd asked me to write a couple of chapters right when I was finishing my graduate degree, and the university let me count it as my master's thesis, which was, I could not have done it were it not that. So I finished that, began feeling like, first of all, I wanted to be on the secondary side more completely, but also that I wanted to get back closer to my hometown of New York City, where my parents were aging, as much as I loved the state of Maine. And I also felt a call to go back to a faith-based school environment. And Bates had fulfilled a lot of that for me because of its deeply moral and kind of ethical principles. But as I looked at secondary schools, I went Quaker. That was my background. I had been educated by Quakers in high school and was very lucky to land a college counseling position at Westtown School, which was the granddaddy of the Quaker Day and boarding schools outside of Philadelphia. That was the fall of 91, where, for anyone interested in true trivia, in my first graduating class were 2 gentlemen who you may have heard of, Brennan Barnard and Shareem Herndon Brown. So 2 men who have gone on to become leaders, especially in writing in our college admissions profession, were seniors that year, which is pretty hysterical to think about that.
And they both ended up being assistants at some point
Yeah, they both worked in the college counseling office
they
at
both worked in the
Westtown.
college counseling.
I was reliving my
office.
experience with Mark Hatch.
Yes. I know this is a pun, but the Susan tree has a lot of limbs on it. And I was just thinking the other day, I really don't think I'd be doing this podcast, Susan, if you hadn't taken me under your wings and to work with you for 9 years. So
that's the real point of all of this, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is to pass, to help propel other wonderful people in the profession that you love, and then get to work with them. Absolutely. Very shortly after I got to Westtown, a couple enormous things happened. One was that the World Wide Web, which is so funny to call it that now, right? But that's the WWW, was released to public domain in the early 90s. And colleges began designing web functionality at that moment. And it was an overnight explosion of functionality in this profession. The other thing that happened at exactly the same time were the U.S. News rankings. And I sat on the first counselor advisory committee at U.S. News. They received so much criticism right off the bat. They felt they could appease the public a little bit if they brought a group of counselors on and appeared to be networking professionally instead of just doing this big money grab. Because all they could say is that their first edition equaled the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition in terms of revenue. And they just put their foot in their mouth as the second that they had an opportunity. So anyway, I sat on that advisory committee and we absolutely gave them hell right from the very beginning. They didn't know what they were in for, but we couldn't stop it, but we tried to turn the tide as well as we could. A lot of us ended up throwing in the towel and putting our efforts in other ways, but we saw the potentially destructive influence of the rankings on popular culture. And it continued, I think, to be one of the battles that all of us have fought since then.
And Mark, what do you remember as your standout topics or thoughts from the 90s? Because that's also the time cell phones became more popular. And
Blackberries or flip phones.
Yeah.
I think, leaving college admissions and going to college counseling for 6 years in the early 90s, at the same time when U.S. News came out and the World Wide Web came out, what was immediately apparent for me is how much mail the students were getting. And back, it was still snail mail. It wasn't quite, it wasn't email yet. The internet was an intranet where you communicated within your own institution, but not always externally. But I remember a student at Harvard Westlake who saw me write a letter of recommendation on a yellow notepad. And he said, "Mr. Hatch, why are you doing that?" And 3 days later, he came in with a laptop that he had built for me.
Oh, my gosh.
And, asked if I put it together in front of me. And that was sort of the work from home moment for me, for better or for worse, that you could actually take work home with a laptop and do your and do letters of recommendation or your class prep. But it was the amount of noise in front of high school students at that time, in part because of the convergence of the direct mail, the World Wide Web, U.S. News rankings, and then I think shortly thereafter, Common App goes from a paper application to the floppy disk. And right around the time I actually switched back into college admission in 1997, after Prop 209, the Anti-Affirmative Action Initiative, was passed in California, that I joined the board at the Common App and saw some real changes, people trying to do good things for students. But the craziness, the mania really had picked up at that time. So much noise. And my first foray into perhaps the amount of pressure that 18-year-olds felt, with many colleges in their face, and this sense of prestige and rankings.
And I know another thing we talked about in this decade was enrollment management seemed to really take off. Can you, Mark, tell our listeners, not everybody will know, some will, what enrollment management is and how it sort of differed from the approach that was used before, and maybe pros and cons? I mean, just anything you want to share on that.
A lot of big data, and or the beginnings of some big data. It wasn't in databases like it was 10 years later, but trying to predict yield, for example, students were clearly applying to more colleges and universities. U.S. News was rating back then pretty significant weight towards admit rate and yield rate. So immediately there was pressure to make those numbers go in the right direction. And the more students you took early decision, the better both of those numbers looked. Yield was a pretty big deal. I worked for a gentleman, Bill Tingley, who had been in admissions since the 60s, and he became the vice president at Occidental College. And I remember trying to build the first yield model for him, coming in and looking at metrics as simple as, did this student visit campus or not visit campus? And what's the difference between the same student from the same high school, whether it's 100 miles away or 500 miles away? And he looked at me with a smile and said, gosh, back in the day when I did it at another liberal arts college, when we had 2.5 file drawers full of women admits and 3 file drawers full of male admits, we called it a day and said, good enough.
I love that. You know what else, Mark Stucker, what was going on there, though, and this complements what Mark Hatch just said, is in the 90s, we had a very strong professional organization overseeing college admissions and high school college counseling, guidance counseling, that had a very, very strong code of ethics and professional practices. So as the noise increased, the noise that Mark Hatch just referred to, and the pressures of colleges paying attention to the rankings and yield and recruiting and all that stuff, we also had a pretty clear sense of what was right and what was wrong. And the student was always at the center of that, even though college institutions wanted to be at the center of it for financial and prestige reasons. The professional association, the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, pulled them back, and there was enforcement of rules such as colleges could not require a deposit before May 1st. They could not pressure students into all sorts of premature commit. It was just, it made sense for everybody. You couldn't have a housing deposit that took money from a family way before the admission deposit. You couldn't have a financial incentive for applying early decision. Interesting. So there was kind of a firm, clear hand. And when colleges were out of line, there was a counseling and punitive response from the association. So I just wanted to say that because we're going to say a little bit something about the current decade in a minute to show you how that's changed.
Now, is this the decade where you feel like college admissions really became more big business? You'll talk to a lot of old timers that will say, feels like there was a shift from service to this feels a little salesy. What do you think about that, Mark?
I also saw on the counseling side, and then when I flipped back to the admission side, the proliferation of merit scholarships. There were some very aggressive increases in tuition, double-digit percentiles, sometimes multiple years in a row. And I think this the introduction of the enrollment management field also was that beginning of how much money do you put on the table, need-based or merit-based? And I was always privileged to work for institutions that met full need, and that was sort of the baseline of what we would do. But then it was a question of, for a student who's at the top of the academic rating, do you put another $5,000 or even $3,000 on top of that? And I do remember on the high school side seeing regional scholarships pop up. A college from Ohio that would admit a student from California and say, you are getting a regional scholarship of $5,000 or $7,000. And that was unsettling on one hand, because we all knew that they were enticing students to choose a school based on price and not based on not based on features or benefits and so forth. I would also say that was the time where at one point the federal government permitted colleges to compare financial aid awards. And I won't name any that I know, but there were institutions that would be 30 miles apart, and the aid directors would meet halfway at a Greasy Spoon diner and compare a paper roster of common admits, and then they would up a package by $200 or $1,000, so a student wasn't choosing between these two competitors based on price. Ironically, perhaps a month before that, the presidents of these institutions might have been calling each other and saying, how far are you going to go up? And if you actually put the data next to one another, many schools were within $150 in terms of their sticker price from each other because of this price fixing. And the feds came in and said, you can't do that.
That's right.
Now, Mark, had you moved to Occidental by this time? Because you mentioned Occidental earlier, and I know that you were in leadership there. What was your role there? Was that this decade or was that the next decade?
It was started in the early 90s. I saw it with kids students that I'd worked with on the high school side. But yes, 97 to 2001, I'd been the director of admission at Occidental. And it was the amount of merit scholarships that were out there. And I actually remember being called by families in April and saying that they wanted to come to Occidental, but 2 days before they got a call from one of our peer schools, and they asked if $3,000 would flip them from one decision to another. And then sometimes the parents would call us and say, will you match this? And that was sort of my first foray into what I would call was negotiation, which was really, really challenging. We simply didn't do much of that at Occidental. We were able to fill our class, but we saw some students who were turning us down because they would shop around a couple of awards, and there were many colleges that were willing to meet or beat a price.
Wow.
Susan, I know we could literally talk hours on each decade. I'm going to try to keep us moving, but anything else from your brain dump on the 90s that you just want to list that our listeners should know also happened that we didn't get a chance to touch base before we transitioned to 2000?
Well, it was the beginning of a lot more creative recruiting on the parts of colleges, and that included fly-in programs where colleges started flying in groups of counselors, guidance counselors and college counselors, knowing that they would get years of benefit of showcasing their campus. Colleges would bind together and bring in counselors as well as groups of students, particularly underrepresented students who might not otherwise have a chance to set foot on the campus. The SAT was recentered. If we think about the evolution of standardized testing, suddenly everyone got a lot smarter in the mid-90s because their SATs were higher, which threw some problems into the predictive modeling that colleges were using, and I think probably encouraged a fair number of institutions to take their optional SAT research a little more seriously because of how manipulative that was. The Common Black College application came out in 98. We saw the rise of college community-based organizations and college access organizations working with populations of underprivileged kids in both urban and rural areas. The Americans with Disabilities Act started in 1990 and trickled down into the high schools, and we saw more students with disabilities looking for options on the secondary level, both in terms of accommodations in the admission process and once they were on campus. I think the other thing, and Mark Hatch could speak to this, is colleges started keeping up with the Joneses. And if the college across town built a new gym, you better build one. And if they built a new science building, you better build one. And the amenities on college campuses started becoming not special. They were expected. They were run-of-the-mill. And the amount of money that colleges were having to put into amenities for students, because that's what families expected. And it was a bummer if a family visited and said, well, gee, if you'd only had, a new skating rink or a new, fitness center.
The dorms. I know the dorms. Nobody was going for the whole corridor dorms.
Yeah, I want sweet living in suite dorms. And, so there were a lot of pressures going on and much of that resulted in larger applicant pools, but also, higher prices colleges had to charge.
Susan, can you say a little more about the recentering of the SAT?
They brought the median score back to 500.
It was 420 verbal, 478 or 480 math.
Yeah.
And then it became 500. Wow, I wish that had happened 10 years earlier. Susan wouldn't have had to close her eyes when she read my
No.
You guys are funny. So that's a good segue into the next decade. This concludes part 1 of Mark Hatch and Susan Tree walking us through a recap of the key developments in the last 5 decades of admissions. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and I hope you will do 2 things. Come back and join us next week for the final part, but also tell a friend or someone you want to help that should be listening to this recap of 5 decades of college admissions developments.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Lisa, this is a great question and a complex one.
Oh, yeah, I think this is a really complicated question. It comes to us from Maya from San Diego, California.
Hi, this is Maya from San Diego. Thank you for addressing my question on your podcast. I really enjoy listening while I'm working out at the gym and when we're taking our summer road trips. I'm working with my son and daughter to narrow down their college list, and campus diversity is a very important factor in their decision process. We live in Southern California, and my kids are fortunate to have attended a high-performing public school with a lot of ethnic diversity. But as we search for colleges, it is difficult to find schools that have near the same level of diversity. Some California colleges have as little as 1% African American students. I also recently read an article about a specific college that talked about overt acts of racism on campus. This is concerning because my kids would like to attend a school where they don't feel like they are the only African American students in their class. And as a parent, I want my kids to feel safe and welcomed and thrive on campus. My kids would like to stay near the West Coast, so HBCUs are probably not an option. Do you have any recommendations and suggestions on how we can evaluate a college campus in regards to its commitment to diversity and inclusivity, especially for African American students? Any insight you could provide for the upcoming admission cycle would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things in this question that catch my attention. So Maya, of course, says diversity is really important, high-performing public school, hard to find colleges with similar diversity to California. So first of all, that's a problem I find in general working with Californians. Like, if you look at the racial ethnic diversity, let's just take the UCs. They have such large percentage of Latinx and Asian students, and then throw in multiracial. Like, most of the UCs are under 20% white. Most of them. They're like 16, 13, 18. That's one of the reasons why affirmative action had a hard time getting passed in the state of California. So Californians are just used to a certain level of racial diversity that a lot of times when you start mentioning schools outside of the state in different places, they're like, that's just so people are spoiled by just the array of different cultures that they have in the state. Having said that, this question has another twist to it because it's a Black family, and California does not have a high Black percentage. closer to 5%, where like places like North Carolina and Georgia are closer to 30%. So, but it's tricky because she does want to stay on the West Coast. And she's asking about a lot of things. She's asking about critical mass, which is important, not wanting your kid to be the only and all that comes with that. But then she's also asking, how do you evaluate a campus commitment to diversity and inclusivity? So there are a lot of subjective things there. Certainly, I'm really big on talking to students and talking to parents. And I would look for clubs and organizations that are targeted towards students of color. Schools have multicultural affair offices usually. There's certainly clubs. And you can talk with leaders. You can talk with them about their experiences. You can also request from the institutional research any studies that have been done and see what's there. You can look at things like NESI data and other things like that to get a feel for the pulse of the campus. You certainly can do other things, of course, like, read school newspapers regularly and get a sense of the climate and the hot issues. But I think there's no substitute to actually talking to people, talking to students, talking to parents, talking to even like Black leaders that work at the school and asking them the tough questions. And once again, looking at any data that's been produced. You can also look at things like retention rates. One thing, there's a website I like to use called collegeresults.org. And it's a really good website. And they focus a lot on graduation rates, but they break the data out by gender and by race and also by like Pell recipients. So retention or lack of retention is always an indication that something's going on, right? So you can look on there and see how does the Black student graduation rate and the Black student retention rate compare to the population at large? That's a real easy statistical way to do it without, like, what I'm advocating, the more conversations. That does take a lot of time and some digging. But when I go on there and I see really low, you can actually see some schools have really low, like, Black male graduation rates compared to Black female graduation rates. And I'm on the verge of naming names, but I'm not. But sometimes, it's linked toward Division I athletes and who's admitted and all of that. But that's a really good place to go to see, because when people leave, that's always a sign things didn't work out.
Right.
I always say that for, when I used to be in sales, that's one thing that I would look at when I was interviewing. Like, what's the turnover rate here? Because if you're a good salesperson, you're going to be in demand. There's always going to be someone that's going to offer you a lot of money to do that. And so if yours places like a return, what's that term? Is that term? Return. Is that the name of the thing? Revolving doors. When you go in and out, isn't it turnstile or something like that? Yeah.
Turnstile.
Turnstile. See, I'm always messing up. I get it half right, but I can't get it fully right. I saw this quizzical look on Lisa's face, like, what are you talking about?
Like a pigsty?
Yeah.
A sty in your eye? I'm like going through all the styes I know.
Yeah. Turnstile, that thing. Yeah. If you're like a turnstile, that's bad. That's bad because obviously people vote with their feet. So one simple thing I would do is to use collegeresults.org to take a look at retention data, graduation data by race. But then I would also be having conversations and I would be looking for reports and research. That's what I would do from that qualitative aspect of her question that she's getting at. Like, how can you know that it's a healthy environment? That would be, a lot of that would be anecdotal, but I would want to have conversations with key people. And you can also look for, is there representation at the highest level in the administration as well? Where's the diversity throughout the administration at the highest level? Or is it just, people, the janitorial staff or lower level positions? So you could look for things like that. And I am a believer in critical mass. I think that's important, for healthy self-esteem and for people not feeling all alone. You could also look for the presence of things like the affinity groups and support-based groups like that being there. As far as the numbers piece, you can just do your research. Some schools are going to have it more than others. It's difficult in the West Coast because there's even less Black diversity in the Pacific Northwest. That's one of the challenges that you see. Like, I love a lot of schools in the Pacific Northwest, but just because they're like Vermont and Maine, there's just not a lot of Black people that live around there. So you tend to see like 2 and 3% at a lot of schools. And so the hardest part about her question is that she wants to stay West,
right,
to get it. And so one possibility is just looking at bigger schools, because when you're at a bigger school, let's say it's
even
like
like
Arizona,
the smaller 5% is still like
it's still a lot of
big
people.
Number.
Yeah. So when I talk to people and they say like, I want a certain amount of racial diversity, one thing I ask them is, how important is the percentage versus the number? So if, let's say, you go to a place like Arizona or Arizona State, and let's say it's only still, once the West Coast school, Arizona doesn't have a large Black percentage. So let's say the numbers are still only 3 or 4%, but 3 or 4% of 50,000 now gives you like 1,500 to 2,000 kids. And I know, like at Michigan State, I got very involved in a lot of those things. And Michigan State was like 9% Black when I went. But when we got together and did those kinds of events, there was a lot of Black people because there's a big school. So it was like 9% of 40,000 was bigger than there were more Black kids there than most HBCUs. There were like 3,600 in the whole school. So that might be something that you might want to think about, is not only the percentage, but the total number. And that might lead you to prioritize bigger schools. So that's how I would answer the numbers question. But for the other stuff, I would use some of those other things. Anything you want to add?
No, I think that's great advice. And I hope that they find a good fit.
Yeah, and thanks for sending that question in, Maya. And thanks for being a listener to your Cosmo Kin, and thanks for your kind words. So keep sending these big pipe questions in. You're making us go to Mondays and Thursdays, so you're doing your job. We asked you to step up to the plate. We'll try to do our job and try to get answers out. So thanks, listeners.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, if you missed part 1, I strongly encourage you to go back and listen to Julia and I interviewing Lee Coffin, the Vice Provost of Enrollment at Dartmouth College. Lee's one of the real giants in the profession who's in his 5th decade in admissions. And in part 2 of 4, Lee continues talking about how early decision impacts admissions. Julia asked Lee if not submitting test scores puts a student at a disadvantage at Dartmouth. And Lee breaks some news that I don't think many people know about. Lee then answers the question of what role do AP scores play in admissions decisions. And Lee answers the question, how do you evaluate the student who does not submit his or her test scores in the admission process? Listen and enjoy.
A bigger way of saying what you were imagining, Mark, is I read every file in December and I think this person has identified this place as a first choice, as the first choice. Mm-hmm. Is there a path to a yes? Mm-hmm. To honor that student's affinity and declaration of love. And we don't have that same luxury in March. You know, when students have applied to numerous places, we don't ask them where we sit on their priority list. But we know in December that every single person who has filed an application has made a conscious choice about, this is where I see myself, and if admitted, I will enroll. So I think the trick is to not over-enroll early. I mean, with our peer group, we are on the lower end of the range in terms of percentage of the class that we take. But I think for some students, it's a really wise moment to apply once, to be intentional. And my cautionary tale is people look at admit rates and draw conclusions that, oh, it's easier to get in. It's just a different round with different intentionality. It is not easier. If you were to look at the admitted student profile, there's no daylight between the early and the regular rounds in terms of who and what their academic records and what the rainbow of their identities represent. And I think people make a mistake when they see early as the aspirational round.
Like, I really relate to what you were saying. My oldest daughter's a Davidson alum, the other school out there that believes in the peer rec like you guys, right? And they have the same scenario, right? 2,000 person school, but Division I.
It's hard.
And so, in their case, I mean, ED spots go to usually in the low 60s in terms of percent of the class because it's a 2,000 person school. So I definitely identify with that point you made. I love how you explained it. Julia, do we have you back?
I don't know. Do you?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
I just had to unplug and plug back in.
No problem. I know how to ad lib.
I am the early person to the podcast, but the most technically challenged person.
Well, that's true.
Well, I also just want to back up. I know what Lee said to be true. Like, we've actually had students who applied ED to Dartmouth, and it's never like, oh, let me shoot in the dark. It's always a really intentional, thoughtful choice. And we've had students that have applied ED and been deferred and indeed admitted in the regular round. And we've had students that gone into an equally selective school in the regular round and maybe not Dartmouth ED because the fit wasn't right. So it really is true, people who are listening, that's really how it functions. So
yeah, and come back to this topic when we're in the Dartmouth specific part of your of the conversation, because that point Julia's making is a really important one.
I think so too. I think I would say too, we always say to our like, oh, what's the difference? I'm like, well, first of all, yeah, anyways, but I was like, there's no you love Dartmouth or you don't. It is a very specific sort of feeling for students. So all right, I can ask my not so sexy question about scores, but this actually helps me out super professionally as well, because no one believes, I don't know if Mark has better luck than I do, but scores, ever since a lot of schools have gone, if not the majority, test optional, it is like the question du jour. So, and it really can be different depending on where folks are coming from. So thank you for entertaining these. So this is from, I think, a listener, but just to start talking about scores, but I listened to your interview with Ronnie Turner from WashU. You talked about test scores, and I appreciated the candor. But one thing you said in that interview is that students should differentiate between colleges that were test optional before the pandemic, that is part of their DNA, versus colleges that went test optional because the pandemic forced them to go test optional. It felt like the clear implication was, quote, for schools that did not go test optional before the pandemic, unquote, not submitting test scores could put you at a competitive disadvantage. Is that a reasonable interpretation of what you were saying?
No. So
phew.
Yeah, no. But I mean, I think, and this is always the thing that I've learned over my many years is, it's like that game you play as kids, telephone, where you say something and it starts to mutate a little bit. But the point I make about testing in this optional space is, there are very high profile places that have been test optional for decades. And then there's some that more recently did it, before the pandemic. Each of those institutions has made an intentional policy shift around testing in its admission requirements. And then there's a huge majority of us that we're not having a conversation on our campuses about testing as a required element until the pandemic locked us all in our homes. And I remember the morning in early June 2020 when I got an email from the president of the college board, as all the deans did, that said, we are writing to advise you that we can no longer guarantee access to testing or sites for testing. And when we do have a site, we cannot guarantee public safety in that. I was like, dear God. So I read the email. I called my provost and I said, we need to make this an optional piece. We can't require something that is inaccessible in a public health emergency. And that decision in the spring of 2020 that has been extended several times at this point while we continue to study it, was not a green light to students around the world to ignore their testing. And I think the farther we get from the height of the pandemic when testing was impossible, what we've also been seeing in my pool is most of our applicants have testing. They don't all submit it, but they've got it. And I know that because our friends at the College Board share the data with me, and they say of your pool, a super majority has more than one score. And when they withhold, they're making more strategic decisions about sharing or not sharing related to what your perceived mean of essay. And what I'm saying in the comment that Julia, you just shared is don't game it. I think there are places that were momentarily optional, like MIT, that have now shifted back to this is required because it's valuable and we would like you must submit. There are places like Columbia that have gone the other direction and said we went optional and we're going to stay optional. I think there's a bunch of us that have not called the question yet. I feel like over the next year to two, most of us will make a move in one way or the other to say clearly to students, this is required or this is optional. And, Dartmouth made a lean this year. So for the next cycle, we are recommending testing. We're still optional, but we've shifted to language. It's like election night where they say too early to call, too close to call. So we went from optional, and I was very clear at the beginning and every year since, this was a pause generated by a public health emergency. And if we chose to shift policy, that was going to require a lot of conversation and thought on our campus. So we in this upcoming year, we are optional but recommended, and we're saying to applicants, give some thought to including a score. And the other thing that I would put out there around this testing question is that's for all students. I think students from under-resourced high schools, first-gen backgrounds, sometimes get misguided away from sharing a score that is actually quite strong in their local context. And if submitted, would give the admission officer or committee heightened confidence that the curriculum and the grades from the place that perhaps we don't know as well is actually a strong predictor of success. So I think testing has a role. I've always thought testing has a role. And my guidance in saying, be careful about not using this pandemic moment as a de facto rejection of standardized testing as something that has some value in a selective admission process.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, the recommended resource for episode 357 is one that I went back and forth about including. I have mixed feelings. The name of the book is called Hacking Elite College Admissions, subtitled 50 Surprising Insights on the College Application Process, and it's by Gail Pierre Lewis. So why did I hesitate? Well, I hate this title, Hacking Elite College Admissions, because it sort of implies once you know the secrets, then you're going to get in. And that's just a complete oversell. Another thing I don't like is, this is a quote from the book, this book serves as a comprehensive guide. No, it's not. It's not a comprehensive guide. So you're saying that, well, Stuck, then why are you recommending it? Well, Gail Pierre Lewis did serve as an admission officer at Georgetown. She wasn't a VP of enrollment, dean of admission, director, or a long-term veteran, but she has read thousands of files at a highly selective school. And I do feel that there are insights in this book that easily make it worth the $5 on Kindle or the $14.50 on as a paperback. You just need to pull away 2 or 3 extractions from a book like this, and it easily justifies the cost. It's also interesting, good quotes, quick, easy read. One of these books you can bang out in less than 2 hours if you read, relatively quickly, 3 or 4 if you're a little slower. And I do think that you will come away pretty pleased with it. It does have stupendous reviews on Amazon. It's got like all 5-star reviews or close to all 5-star reviews. 84% 5-star, 8% 4-star reviews. And so, it's worth a read, but just decry the title. And I don't want you to think that if you learn these insights or tips that all of a sudden, like the Red Sea parts and you go to the school of your choice. But I understand that you need to have a catchy title sometimes to get people to buy your books. But that's a recommended resource for episode 357. Now return to our interview with Lee Coffin.
Does that make sense as I
well,
spell it out that way?
I appreciate the clarity of recommended, because it sounds like it was always valued, and maybe more so than at some places. I don't know if that's fair to say.
Well, I think the thing that I've noticed in the last 3 cycles since, COVID scrambled all of our norms, and I would include in that scramble a preponderance of A's from most high schools around the world. And what has been really challenging when, we have 29,000 applicants at Dartmouth for 1,150 seats, and a super majority of them are straight A students at this point.
Sure.
And when you take all testing, SAT, ACT, the subject tests were dropped by College Board right before the pandemic. Sure. And, something I lament because I thought there was value there. Some schools don't do APs at all. Some students take them after the admission process. So being able to norm a grade and say this A paired with that score tells me something. Or that B, when they exist, paired with that score is a representation of rigor in that high school. And a B in that course of study at that school is fantastic. And the testing is a way of pairing these two things together and making a bit more sense out of big pools. And it's also, I don't think a lot of us are talking about the utility of data as a way of sorting big pools. And, your last episode was on AI, and maybe this won't be the next episode, but let me say this again. You had a recent episode where you talked about the introduction of AI into some college admission processes. And I think what's really starting to happen is using machine learning to a degree to help us sort and focus on the students in the pool that are really in the mix. And testing is one of, not the only, data points that helps us do that.
Would you say it's also fair to say AP testing also plays a role of that? I mean, you've got AP tests in 10th and 11th.
Yeah.
And someone's got mostly 5s, and someone else has mostly 3s.
I've seen students from under-resourced schools where the percentage of kiddos who go to a 4-year college is quite low, have class ranks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the class, and an AP score of a 1.
Right.
And that's especially alarming when it's in the quantitative areas, because what we see when we do our research is the 1 on AB or BC Calc or physics is a real handicap as someone moves into a fast-paced math-centered curriculum. And a 3, you're okay. 4, 5, you're still going to have your hands full. I was talking to one of our engineering students this spring, and he said, I thought I was smart. And then I got into this calc sequence. I thought, this is harder than anything I've done. And I said, and you figured it out. But, the ingredients from high school, when I peaked after we had that conversation, they were all there. He just had to take his kind of muscle and train it in a new way. But that's where, if an AP score or an IB score in the International Baccalaureate space, they're helpful. But they're helpful when they're paired with the transcript. And I think that's the piece that gets lost in a lot of the fussing about testing, is it's not a score by itself. Big scores all alone don't tell us everything we need to know. And a softer score, and I'm saying softer as opposed to low because it's relative. We have data that comes through the College Board where we can look at the high school and see what's the 75th percentile of students who tested from that senior class in recent years. And a score that could be hundreds of points below my mean could be hundreds of points above the 75th percentile in that local context, that's fantastic. And we do read that way and make discerning evaluations based on the data in its local origin. And hard to map that out across a big applicant pool, but we do it. And
great. I have one more testing question. I think Julia has one more as well. So this is a question I've asked quite a few admission officers, and I got very different answers. And that is, how do they respond when they see a student has taken a number of AP courses in, say, 10th and 11th, and they have chosen not to share their AP scores? And so I've heard everything from, well, Chris Peterson at MIT, he was very clear. This was before, they made their announcement. Of course, that was SAT, ACT, that not sharing your scores will not help you with us. You'd be better to share them and explain your context. But you're not giving us anything to work with. And then I've had other admission officers say everything from, we don't judge what we don't see. How do we know that grandma didn't die the night before? I've had other admission officers say, we look at the school, and is this a well-resourced kid from a well-resourced school where almost everybody is sharing their scores? We take that into consideration. I've had another person say, we will sometimes follow up. And we followed up, and sometimes it's just been completely accidental, or we followed up, and some people have sometimes said, oh, we looked and you weren't giving credit for it anyway. So answers are all over the place as to what inferences are made when you see a student has taken AP exams and has chosen not to share scores. How does Dartmouth look at that?
So I think I'm going to go down another path.
We love talking about the nuances of college admissions.
Yeah, no. I mean, as I was listening to you tee up that question, the thought bubble coming up from my head was, if we want the scores, we should require them. Mm-hmm. So I've never worked at a place where the AP score is required. So there are lots of high schools that have AP courses, but kids do or don't take the test. There are places where there are no AP courses, but people can take the AP. I think they're useful when they're included. I mean, when students put them on their common application, sometimes the high school puts them on a transcript. They're sent officially. Like subject tests, I mean, seeing a 5 in AP US history and looking at the grade and saying, oh, that was a B+ and a 5, useful. Or that's an A+ and a 5, useful. Or, I have never been part of an admission process. I think this is going to be an idiosyncratic answer, where we play gotcha. Mm-hmm. I don't see myself as a forensic detective looking at a transcript and asking why not. If something's required, it must be, it must be in the file. If we're not requiring it, whether it's there or not, is the student's choice. And when it's not, I honestly, as I'm answering this question, thinking, can I recall reading a file and saying, wow, the AP course is on this transcript and no testing? I don't think that way. It's also rare, I should say. Like usually when you see AP courses on transcripts, there's usually a string of AP exams connected to that file in some way. But when they're not, I don't raise an eyebrow. And at Dartmouth and at Tufts, as dean, I have never led my team towards that kind of skepticism about the scores are missing, therefore they must be hiding something.
Thanks. Friends, this concludes the second part of Julie and I interviewing Lee Coffin, the Vice Provost of Enrollment at Dartmouth College. We hope you join us next week for part 3.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, I'm here with Kevin Newton, and our regular listeners know he is no new person to our podcast. He's actually a regular member of our team. But Kevin, we get new listeners all the time, so I'm going to ask you to do the brief 60 to 90 second overview of who you are in case someone is not familiar with you?
Sure. Mark, of course, thanks for having me here. My name's Kevin. I'm the founder of An Education Abroad, and we're an educational consulting firm that focuses solely on helping American students find spots to earn degrees overseas.
Yeah, and friends, Kevin's so good at what he does that quite honestly, for me, when I have someone that comes to us and wants international work, I just say, hey, Kevin is our guy who does that. He's a specialist. I can handle US and Canada. And he has just been fantastic to work with. And so we have him come on the podcast. We like to have him come on around once a quarter and talk about anything that he's sort of hearing overseas. Sometimes he focuses on a school. Sometimes he focuses on a unique region of the country. And so he reached out to me this time and he said, I think it'd be interesting for your listeners to know how the UCAS system does something very different than American schools when it comes to how they handle wait lists. So, Kevin, I'm just going to let you take it from there, but I realize some people may not be familiar with UCAS at all. So you're going to have to start with an overview of UCAS before you go into that. So take it away.
Absolutely. So UCAS is essentially the common app on steroids that's used by schools in the United Kingdom to act as a single application that streamlines the admissions process. So whether you're applying to the University of Manchester, St. Andrews, or Oxford or Cambridge, you're using UCAS as an undergrad. And one of the criticisms of UCAS for many Americans is that it only lets you apply to 5 programs initially. And there are a number of reasons for this, but a lot of people feel kind of hemmed in by that. Well, what happens if I don't get into any of those 5 programs? Or if I get waitlisted by one of those 5 programs, what do I do? And luckily, UCAS has a system for that in place. And this past year, we've seen a lot of changes to it. It's known as clearing. And essentially what happens in a nutshell is after the first round of 5 programs by every student who wants to apply, British universities report what spots they still have open in programs. And students are given a second pass through and then a third pass through. So the goal is to go layer by layer through this and try to help make sure students end up with maybe not a list of 20 acceptances, but acceptances at universities that they're very excited to study at.
Wow, that's great. So what are your thoughts on how it differs from our waitlist system?
So I'm probably a little biased in this, admittedly.
Mr. International. I know where you're going.
I do think that there's something a bit more inherently fair about it. But then again, it's the benefit of having a centralized admissions program as opposed to the US where, sure, you've got Common App and Coalition App, but there's no single authority that dares to dictate to an American university how they should handle admissions. They essentially just...
Well, just to prove your point, Kevin, you also have a lot of schools that just accept their own application directly on their own website in addition to Common App and Coalition. And then you've also got things like the UC system and Apply Texas and QuestBridge and Black Common App and Universal App. And so there's, CAPEX has its own app. So yeah, our system is dominated by Common App, but a lot of other people, including applying directly on your own website. And I actually think Coalition is going to really grow with their new partnership now that they have with Technolutions and SCORE.
And you see, Mark, this is why I do international admissions, because you may as well have been speaking Greek to me right there.
Well, that's how I feel when I talk to you. Off the phone in our conversations, casual ones.
But to get more into the details of how clearing works, it can be a chaotic process, but Americans actually have a bit of an advantage here, believe it or not. So for those who are unfamiliar with the way UK admissions tends to work, is that you more often than not receive a conditional offer sometime in March or April. Earlier if you're applying to Oxford or Cambridge, but usually around March or April. That will include that you need to do so well on any AP tests, your IB diploma, any dual enrollment or community college classes, or even your ACT or SAT. Sometimes they'll even list a GPA requirement, but it's always going to be academic. And What this does is if you fall short of that, of course, we always recommend contacting the university and seeing if there's any leeway they can grant you. Some universities are very friendly about this, others aren't. And of course, if you're missing an SAT score by 10 points, it's a bit different than missing your AP score by 3 points. So that's always our first recommendation. But beyond that, what clearing allows you to do is, again, add more programs to see if they'll be interested in you. Now, British universities have very clear minimum requirements, and they publish these for American universities as well. Typically, the general rule of thumb I say is to look at the A-level requirements, and if it says that you need 3 A's, then you're going to need 3 5s. If it says you need B's, then those are 4s, C's are 3s. There are some exceptions where they want 5 scores of 5 on the AP, or 3 5s and 2 2s, but that's getting a little too specific. So from there, you request again to have another program either at the same university.
Can I stop you for a sec?
Please do.
Where would people find out those specifics? Because obviously if they are interested in the schools, they're going to want to know the specifics. So what would be the source for finding that out?
The 2 best places to go are either the program's website, which is going to be the most reliable, and you can also find a lot of information at UCAS, UCAS.com, and you can search for different universities. Something I'm really passionate about is don't ever pay for access to just a database of doing your own searches. There are these databases sponsored at a country level all over Europe and Australia, New Zealand, etc. Of course, I don't want to, how should I put this? There's a difference between access to a database and access to an expert. And that's all I'm going to say about that so that we don't get too commercial. But anyway, look there and it will have the requirements. And a lot of them will also have requirements for international students, because if you're going in with APs, there's often an ACT or SAT requirement. Not always, but it's worth looking at that. So there are 2 phases of clearing that really Americans should concern themselves with. The first is clearing extra, which is the easiest to get into. And that's because it's pretty automatic. If you don't hold an offer from one of your first 5 universities or first 5 program choices after all offers have been released, which means either everyone has rejected you or you don't want to go anywhere, you've not accepted any of the offers that you've been given, you can apply one by one to different programs. And it's a maximum of 21 days and they get back to you. This can still be done while you're waiting on your test scores. And it's just as if you are adding another slot and you're likely going to get a conditional acceptance and you move on with that. But what I found a lot of people really benefit from is the international clearing process. And this is something that Americans do have an advantage over British students with, because AP scores are typically released the first week of July. Most British students don't get all of their qualifications released until sometime in August. So for students who may be on the wait list at their dream school in the US or didn't get in anywhere or have had a change of heart or anything like that, for whatever reason, you can go into clearing for international students. By this point, you've got all of your qualifications. So all of your AP scores, your ACT, SAT, any dual enrollment classes are done. You graduated from high school. You have there's no reason for them to give you anything other than an unconditional offer. And you go on UCAS and search for clearing choices. Now, not everyone offers clearing. Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, St. Andrews, Imperial College, UCL, and King's, the big names, are not going to do clearing because their yield rates are upwards of 80%. They don't have a problem filling their classes.
And just for friends, LSE is London School of Economics.
Right. Thanks, Mark. But that doesn't mean there aren't great places that maybe have a few extra spots. And what you can study really varies widely. If you manage to get through the maze of caveats to be interested in medicine overseas, which there are, I can think of 6 caveats that, I would advise before you consider that decision. There are medicine spots open. There are plenty of law spots open. There are plenty of business spots, engineering spots, computer science spots. But it's also, if you want to study history or science or really anything, you can find a place. And as an American, because you've already got your scores and it can be a confirmed offer, that's the sweet spot to be looking, is between the day you get your AP or IB results and the beginning of August. And there are 2 ways of really applying. Most universities, especially those that tend to attract more overseas students, are going to have just an application button on their website where you put in a few basic details about yourself, including your test scores, and you hit apply. Now, you have to have applied through UCAS first. So you don't put any choices in UCAS unless you've already applied through the original cycle in UCAS. But you still need to make sure your letter of recommendation and your personal statement are there, which those take some time to do. I think that, you've got to make sure you've got that prepared, because you cannot just copy and paste your Common App personal statement. It's got to be a bit more focused than that. But what you'll find then is, after submitting your interest, the universities will start reaching out to you. And their goal is to get you an answer quick enough that you can turn around and have a student visa processed and get accommodations. In fact, a lot of universities will guarantee your accommodations for your first year if you apply during clearing. So that's the best possible route. What we're seeing from about the middle of August on is probably the most chaotic route. And that's when everyone else in the UK gets their scores. So it sounds crazy to those of us who are used to the American system of being on a wait list, writing a letter of continued interest, and then constantly having that battle with ourselves. Do I reach out to the admissions office and make sure they got the letter of continued interest, or am I going to bug them? And I speak from personal experience, because this was me several years, many moons ago.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Kevin did his undergrad at College of William & Mary, and then he did his master's degree overseas at, tell me the name again.
It's, I shudder every time I say it to anyone used to, because it's perfectly acceptable in the UK, but it comes off as mildly offensive here. The University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. So
it's okay. It's just long. It's nothing offensive. It's just long. That's why I can never remember it. Try remembering it in Arabic sometime.
No,
thank you.
They've got this wall of glass embossed with the name of the school and all the different languages they teach. And, when you could get to know in 2 or 3 of those, you felt pretty good about yourself. But anyway, so if you apply after around August 15th or so, you're calling these universities, or you're doing live chat with these universities. And this is chaotic, as you can imagine, because we're not used to this as Americans. We're not used to the ability to just call someone up and say, hey, I got 3 4s on my AP tests and history, calculus, and chemistry. Can I come study business? And we're not used to that, but that's how it happens. And it throws a lot of Americans for a loop. But it absolutely is how things get done overseas, or especially in the UK now.
I have a question. I think it would really throw Americans off even more now, because we're moving into this test optional is the norm mode. 95% of Common App schools are test optional. That's probably going to grow even more this next year. You literally have 3 states, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, that require test scores for public schools. That's it. And then Georgetown and MIT. You've mentioned test scores a lot in this conversation, going back and forth between SAT, ACT, and AP or IB. Are you seeing any test optional talk over there in the UCAS system, or is that just like dead on arrival because the system is based on it? It's, one of the reasons why Tennessee, Georgia, and Florida haven't gone there is because their whole merit scholarship system has a test score component to it, and they haven't been wanting to eradicate that, and so they've sort of stayed anchored to it. But any thoughts?
I think what we're starting to see as a result of the pandemic, not so much the test optional movement here in the US, but as a result of the pandemic, is there was a loosening of that. It's not happening at universities that are necessarily able to attract a lot of American applicants on their own.
So, Len, that's a politically correct way of saying less selective schools.
Yeah, exactly.
I got to read through the lines on that one, Kevin. You can be PC when you need to be.
Well, I should, give that a caveat of its own, because St. Andrews, which attracts probably more American applicants than anywhere except possibly Oxford and Cambridge. In fact, I think that the last numbers had them as attracting more than Oxford and Cambridge at the undergraduate level. They are very happy to look at a student's transcript and make an evaluative choice off of that. I don't want to categorize them as going fully test optional in the long term. And again, the test scores needed are a little bit, other than the APs, which I feel it's a matter of being able to prove your ability within that subject because it's relevant to what you're studying. It's not that you're submitting an AP German score to study biology or something like that.
So what about a student that has decent APs? And I usually think of decent as 4s and above, even that 3 is considered a pass technically. A lot of times for more selective schools, I use the term qualifying score. A qualifying score oftentimes is a 4 or above, but we know that's completely university dependent. And for some 3s are fine, right? But what about a student that, let's just say for this sake, has good scores by the college's standard, whether that's 3s, 4s, or 5s, but they either have modest ACT or SAT or they don't have it at all? How will that student fare in the process at these schools?
It depends based on the university. So some places will, if they have high enough AP scores or enough AP scores, completely waive the ACT or SAT requirement. Okay. I can't remember. I believe it's either Edinburgh or Oxford that the requirement's either 3 AP scores plus the ACT or SAT or 4 AP scores. So that's a definite loophole. But what we're seeing is that a lot of these universities are also becoming more open to that. They finally figured out that a student doesn't have to take the AP test to still be doing well in the AP course. And
no, that was my next question for you, because I'm sure you're probably aware there is a movement in this country, and it's been going on now for about 20 years. I experienced it back in 06 or 07 when I was doing college counseling and boarding school admissions, that your more selective independent schools are moving away from AP, feeling they can create their own customized courses with more depth and creativity. I remember one reason we did it at Westtown is because we had historical archives on our own campus. And for a history course, we could have someone do original research in our archives that people normally do in grad school in the high school level.
Right.
And so we were like, why are we conforming to some outside standard? And the colleges actually loved it. But that's because they had evidence that our schools were preparing people well. And that's been a movement. We did in the news maybe a year or so ago, maybe a year and a half, a cadre of the most selective schools in the DC market all took the jump simultaneously at one time to move away from AP. So I find it quite frequently at your highly selective independent schools are no longer tethered to AP or even IB, but they have their own advanced curriculum. And those students do very well in our college process over here. Are they hindered in the UCAS system because there's not tangible deliverables?
So it differs, unfortunately. What we found is that a lot of British universities are very happy to take a look at a curriculum. If there's, I don't want to call it demonstrated interest because it's not quite the demonstrated interest that we see here in the US. But if a student reaches out early and has a conversation with the university And there could be a number of different outcomes. Sometimes it may be, well, we still need you to register for some form of test. Once upon a time, the SAT subject test satisfied that requirement. Obviously, they're no longer a thing. Sometimes students will be encouraged to register independently for an AP test. Other times, students will be encouraged to take an A-level, which is kind of it's the British qualification that you take that specializes in an area that, again, is very similar to an AP test, but has some differences. One of which, worth mentioning, is that most of them are almost entirely free response. So it feels more like a history class or AP history document-based question than it does multiple choice questions. So there are some exceptions to that, but they're certainly willing to have that conversation. And again, I think what you see is universities that attract more students from the US, with the exception of St. Andrews, Trinity College, Dublin, University of Glasgow, and beginning to be University of Edinburgh, but I don't want to quite put them at that same level yet. So I guess the other way of putting it would be Oxford, Cambridge, and LSE tend to be a bit more strict. Those three, whereas others are, once you kind of get out of that, not a very well-known universities over here that attract a number of American applicants, universities are much more willing to look. Some universities do tend to take a bit of a hard line with it. And honestly, there are times that I'm left scratching my head saying, your British standards don't measure up to what you're asking from American students. And there's a big gulf there, and it doesn't make sense to me. I'm not going to call out anyone by name, but there's one university that I don't get why they're asking for such just difficult American requirements when their British requirements are pretty easygoing in comparison. At the same time, you've got other universities that will have their AP requirements, but then they'll also say, but if you've got a 3.0 in honors and AP level classes, we'll look at your application and have a conversation with you. And, we're open to that. So I think that's the way that it's moving. But the problem remains that, and just to be blunt, with thousands of American high schools and huge gulfs of differences between, like we've mentioned before, I live here in Dallas, and my children will probably go to high school somewhere here in Dallas, which is somewhere in the metro area is going to have better high schools than, let's say, that I went to in a small town in Appalachia, just by virtue of funding and things like that. I think that they still lean on those tests as a very imperfect way, but the importance has gone down significantly.
Friends, this concludes the first part of Kevin Newton teaching us about clearing and the UCAS system. I hope you join us next week for the final part. Friends, on Monday's episode, I'm going to share some insights from a session I went to at Emory University yesterday that had 5 schools, Emory and Rice and Cornell and Wash U in St. Louis and Pomona in California. And I'm actually going to share insights this week and next week. And so this week, I'm going to talk about some key trends that all 5 of those schools talked about on a range of 3 different topics. I think you're going to really like it, so you're going to want to tune in Monday for that. And friends, we'll start a brand new interview Lisa did with Brian Burdages, and it's about fraternities and sororities. It's really making a positive case for the value of fraternities. And thanks to Kevin Newton, who referred us to Brian. Hope to see you on Monday, friends. And remember, it's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's not where you go. But it's what you do when you get there, and it's what you do when you get out of there. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.